Greetings, class. We're going to continue the discussion of alternatives to negotiated agreements with the WATNA. That's the worst alternative to a negotiated agreement, and how to use it. So, as was previously discussed, uh, in negotiations, we can reach parts where there's a presumed stalemate. That is, the highest that a buyer is willing to pay is lower than the least a seller is willing to accept for it, right? The gap between my hands here would be the distance between offers. There is no overlap in potential for agreement. So in that case, um, it's not likely that an agreement would be reached. And part of what I would encourage a person to do in that position is to consider their best alternative to the negotiated agreement and consider whether or not, in fact, staying at this fixed point or at that boundary is what you want to do in terms of what's best for you proceeding in the negotiation or leaving the negotiation. Um, so in some negotiations, the offers are here, but actual willingness, right? Like the buyer and the seller might actually have points where there's an overlap here. And getting to that point, which is something that they can live with, just hasn't happened through the strategic process employed, right? If you lowball and there's no match, people might not feel like there's enough movement that they're going to be able to get to what they want to, and they might give up before they get there. Sometimes people are used to shuttle diplomacy with more steps. This might happen in, say, real estate or something, where a broker goes between different groups. In some legal settings, it kind of works the same way, where a lawyer, a mediator, familiar with that, will go back 7, 8, 9, 10 times before they finally get to that part in the middle. And if somebody doesn't start with the low ball and they just keep moving slowly, the perception is that they'll end up getting more in the long run by playing it that way. But not everybody's familiar with those strategies. They're not guaranteed to work. But again, so best alternative is if I don't sign an agreement with you today, we don't leave the courtroom, you don't drive home in the car I just sold you. The alternative is, what are you going to do next? And so the best alternative is the way of thinking about, all right, if I leave here, I'll just go find something else somewhere else and I'll be able to get what I want at the same price. It's just going to take me some more time, kind of thinking. Or maybe it's thinking like, if I don't get it, I'll actually be able to get it for a better price from someone else. It could be any number of things, right? The next buyer will pay me what I'm asking for it. All I have to do is wait and somebody will appreciate what I'm selling, kind of thing. Well, the worst alternative to the negotiated agreement is the other end of the reality check, which is that I'm trying to sell a car. Maybe nobody else will come, right? Maybe you're literally the only buyer that was going to be interested. And if I don't sell to you for what you're offering today, then I might go a month without a buyer. And at that point in time, I'd feel like I had really made a mistake by not taking what I could when I could have. Right? That's a bad alternative. I'm not saying it's necessarily a likely alternative, but weighing in what the worst alternative. The worst alternative to the buyer might be that this might have been the best car that they were going to be able to find at the best price, and from here on out, it might not work out well. The worst alternative might be that if I don't buy this car today, then I might have to get a rental car to drive to and from work for the next week because I won't have time to go car shopping. And the rental car is going to cost me money. And I'll have less money to go shopping with when I look for a car next week. And if I don't find a car next week, then I'm going to have to use a rental car again. And what I can afford today won't be what I can afford. And by the time I'm able to go car shopping again, I really might have put myself into a pinch. You might be willing to pay more than what something's worth if you consider the alternative, which is that you're going to have to spend money or use resources or waste time that could be better used in other areas. Um, so what I said with the best alternative to the negotiated agreement also holds true when thinking about the worst alternative to the negotiated agreement, right? Once you think about, all right, if I don't reach a settlement with this person and I go before the judge might find in favor of the other person. You should reflect upon what do you think the chances of that are, right? If you feel fairly confident in your case, um, take that into account, right? Don't start settling for things just because you're afraid that it might not work out. But also keep in mind that lots of people who say that they're innocent end up being convicted. Lots of people who are guilty get away with crimes. But most of the time, we expect the system to work, right? So if you think that there's a chance that the judge will agree with you, but you don't think it's likely that you're going to get everything that you want from the judge, weigh that against. If you think that it's unlikely that your adversary is going to get the judge to agree with them, right? Maybe don't consider your worst alternative to be that I completely lose, but your worst alternative might be that you lose 50%. And if you lose 50%, and then that's worse than what you're being offered now, that should impact your calculus. Like, how much are you willing to risk in terms of reaching an agreement? One of the other details that I would frequently reflect on while caucusing with a person in small claims court was the instructions. Right, this was in Multnomah County of Portland, Oregon. So the instructions in court are different, but the instructions there were consistent with the known statistics at the time, that people were more likely to pay when they had reached an agreement through mediation than they were through a judgment. And there's a variety of reasons that might take place. But sometimes reaching an agreement might be better for you because it actually means that the person's going to actually pay you what they've agreed on, as opposed to winning in court and then still not getting paid because the cost of collections and so forth, right? So the worst alternative to the negotiated agreement might mean I win in court but still don't get paid, right? Something is better than nothing, right? So if you start putting all of the reality, right? If you play agent of reality and think what is actually going on here, you are in a much better position, right? Using these tools, BATNA and WATNA, you're in a much better position to think about the range, right, of what you're willing to offer, what you're willing to accept, in terms of being rationally oriented towards your substantive concerns. What you'd like to do is sell high, or what you'd like to do is buy low. But if you do that, and you're not getting what you want, you might consider that there might be a calculus where paying more than something's worth might still end up being better for you in the long run, or selling for less than what something's worth might be better for you in the long run, right? These are all parts of the negotiation equation. The BATNA and the WATNA are just strategic tools that we can employ in considering whether or not our options lay out our best strategy for the future. Again, especially when we're getting to the part of a negotiation where it appears like an impasse may be likely, or the potential for impasse could be costly. You get so close, you've put so much into the agreement, not being able to make the last step. That's also one of the factors, right? Dealing with BATNA and WATNA from the position of used car sales is helpful from the standpoint that there's no relationship, but Part of what's lacking from the conversation is the part where relationships actually do matter in a lot of negotiations, and that frequently lots of hard work goes into the negotiations. One can imagine much more complex disputes like contract negotiations where like you have the union and the management and so forth. And if you have 35 different items that you've been going over, you've been very systematic and strategic and going after the most important concerns. Well, if you've been able to get what you wanted on the 17 things that were most important to you, and you were able to give up some of what you want, right? Compromise on the 17 things that were most important to the other party. And now you've got that one last thing, and you're just not able to reach the agreement on it. Looking at all the work you've put into this contract negotiation, your BATNA says, if we don't settle, well, we'll end up being able to get what we want later. Okay. The WATNA says that actually, by not agreeing to this last point, you might be out the progress you've made on all of those other details. Are you willing to sacrifice a good agreement on most of your most important concerns and let that like be left in the balance on the last detail? Right? That's something that does happen, right? People sometimes bend as far as they can and they don't reach agreement. Don't get me wrong. You should not always feel like that there should be more compromise or more willingness to be flexible. But when you make the choice that you aren't willing to bend anymore, and you encourage the other side to consider the potential opportunity costs for not caving on that last sticking point as well, you should do so knowing, right? You should do so with a really profound understanding about what the range of settlement was, what the cost of not having an agreement is, and what the likely outcomes now will be, right? If what you've ended up doing was reaching an agreement on wages, working hours, vacation time, sick time, and all of these things which are crucially important. But what you've been stuck on is something like employee parking. Well, now you might be without a need for parking spaces for days, weeks, months, or years, right? Lack of a working contract might just signify that the closing doors of a business, right? The worst alternative to a negotiated settlement really might be that a business decides it's just simply not profitable to continue and might pivot to something else. And that could impact both the management side and the employee side. Management might also have alternatives that include that they're in a position where maybe it's just not effective to continue doing the type of business, and maybe their awareness of that option might signify something differently to them if they really consider what the true opportunity costs are or what the true opportunity benefits are. Again, this is a tool that you can use in mediation. As the mediator, you can encourage, I recommend again in caucus, to have parties be very realistic in thinking about what do they think is the best thing that could happen if they don't reach a settlement? What's the worst thing that could happen if they don't reach a settlement? What do they think is the most likely thing to happen if they don't reach a settlement? And if the thing that they think is most likely to happen if they don't reach a settlement is worse than what they're being offered, you should ask them to consider whether or not they want to sacrifice what they're being offered now for the chance to do better when they actually believe it's likely that they'll do worse. At the same time, if you're in caucus and the person comes up with they believe that they'll do better if they're not in the mediation anymore, your job isn't to encourage them to reconsider where they're at. It's to help them think strategically about what's likely to happen, right? But your job isn't to help people get what they want. Your job is to help commit yourself to a process that leads people to settlements where agreement can be reached. Again, playing the agent of reality, getting people to think about what's likely to happen, getting them to understand that there are a range of potential outcomes, and that they may not get what they want, may be helpful in stimulating the process. But at the end of the day, your job isn't to reach an agreement, it is to run a smooth, comfortable process. In a negotiation, on the other hand, you don't have any responsibility to the other party, but you really should do as much as possible to think strategically about the outcomes that are likely to impact your life, using these tools to help think about what that range are. That's something that I highly encourage. Especially, like I've said, just to reflect on it for one last time, especially where relationships don't matter. When relationships do matter, maybe potentially add that to part of the cost. If you're not offering the person enough money, but it's likely to hurt their feelings or make them feel differently about your relationship to them, and the relationship's important, if that has a factor, include that as part of what you're thinking about in terms of your negotiation. That's it for BATNA and WATNA. I'll see you on the next one.